In this module, we will look at several business frameworks. These business frameworks will help us understand the business and set the context for the information technology or the computing components within a business. This first framework, known as Porter's Five Forces model, will help us understand how a particular organization operates within its industry structure, and how it competes within that structure. Porter's five forces, or five elements of industry structure, consist of the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of customers, the threat of new entrants or new businesses into that industry structure, and the threat of substitute products. And finally, these four elements play into the fifth element, which is the competitive rivalry within an industry. Now, keep in mind that these five forces are not independent. So the four elements certainly play into the competitive rivalry, but there's also intersection or interaction between the other four. So in the next few slides, we'll look at each of these forces in turn. Let us now look at the first of the five forces, which is buyer power. The first characteristic that impacts buyer power is the availability of choices. Therefore, what we mean by this is that if there are a few buyers and lots of suppliers, buyer power is likely to be higher because the buyer has many more choices. On the other hand, if there are many buyers and just a few suppliers, then buyer power is likely to be low. As an example of this, in the 1980s, there was only one Indian restaurant in Columbus. And so all of us poor Indians were dependent upon that one Indian restaurant if we wanted to have Indian food. So in that case, our buyer power with respect to that Indian restaurant supplier power was likely to be very low. The same situation exists if there are many substitute products. And by the way, this is an example of how the five forces interact with each other and are not independent. So when it comes to fast food, once again, for most people, a Big Mac is a substitute for a Burger King Whopper. So there are many substitutes available with respect to fast food. So with respect to the fast food industry, buyer power, in this particular case, consumer power, is likely to be high because there are all these more or less equivalent choices. The second characteristic that affects buyer power is the volume that the buyer buys from the supplier. If the volume is high, then the buyer is likely to have more power. So for example, Walmart buys a lot from its suppliers, from each of its suppliers. And therefore, the buying power of Walmart is likely to be very high because the seller is dependent upon Walmart for such a large proportion of its sales. So the third characteristic that affects buyer power is the proportion of buyer costs. So let's say a buyer is buying something from a seller. If what that buyer buys from that seller is a large proportion of that buyer's total cost, so of all the things the buyer buys from different sellers, this particular seller, the items that this buyer buys from this particular seller is of a high cost when compared to the buyer's total cost. In that case, the buyer is likely to be extremely price sensitive with respect to the product that he or she buys from this high cost seller. This doesn't directly increase buyer power, but influences it. So if there is another seller on the horizon that can sell that product at a lower cost, the buyer is highly incentivized to switch. The next characteristic that affects buyer power is buyer switching costs. So for example, let's say the buyer has incorporated some product from the seller into his or her product. So for example, a laptop maker has incorporated Intel processors in his or her laptop. The switching costs are the cost required to not use Intel chips or the Intel processor in the laptop. So it might mean redoing the motherboard, redoing the pin connections in the motherboard, perhaps redoing the power supply, things like that. So if switching costs are high, the buyers have less power. If switching costs are low, buyers have more power. The next item is the impact of the supplied product on quality. So if the supplier's product has a high impact on the quality of the buyer's product, then the buyer power is likely to be low. So for example, let's say that I'm making steel ships. If the quality of my ship is highly dependent upon the quality of steel, then my buyer power as the shipbuilder is less with respect to the supplier of the steel. The availability of information to the buyer is also likely to affect buyer power. So for example, if the buyer knows exactly what the seller's costs are, then the buyer can negotiate much more strongly with respect to the seller. Walmart is a very good example of this because Walmart's systems, IT systems, are well integrated with the supplier systems, and this was a requirement for doing business with Walmart. Walmart has all kinds of information about how much it actually costs the supplier to make something, and that allows Walmart to negotiate very hard because now Walmart has more complete information. It's the same when you go and buy a car. If you know the price that the car dealer paid the manufacturer, then you can negotiate much harder on price. Pull through is the characteristic by which the seller is dependent upon the buyer in order to sell their product. So for example, let's say that there is a seller of um, laundry detergent that's sold exclusively through Walmart. Then that seller of laundry detergent is dependent upon Walmart for any and all sales of its product. In that case, buyer power is high and seller power is low. The characteristic of brand identity or the ability to influence decision makers does also impacts buyer power. So what this means is the following. Suppose I'm a seller. So suppose I make a product, I'm the buyer, and I buy something from a supplier. And people are buying the product from me because of the brand identity of the supplier versus my brand identity. So for example, consider laptops. If people are buying my laptops because I use Intel processors, then I have less power with respect to Intel. So I, as a buyer from Intel, have less power with respect to Intel. However, if I'm IBM, even though I'm using Intel processors, people are buying computers from me because I'm IBM. In this particular case, I have more power with respect to the supplier of the processor, in this case Intel. Supplier power is the reverse or opposite of buyer power, and you will see that the same elements or similar elements impact supplier power in the opposite way to buyer power. So switching costs, if switching costs are high, then supplier power is high. If there are few substitute inputs, supplier power is high. If buyers are fragmented, many buyers and just a few suppliers, then supplier power is high. If the importance of volume sales to me as a supplier is high, then my supplier power is low. On the other hand, if I don't care so much about volume, or if there are enough buyers buying large volumes from me, then my power is high. Similarly, if my cost relative to the other elements that go into a buyer's product is low, then I have higher power because the buyer is less inclined to switch away from me. And finally, in the same way that the buyer can do backward integration, I as a supplier can do forward integration. If it's easy for me to do forward integration and threaten the buyer that way, then my power as a supplier is likely to be higher. Now note that labor is a supplied good as well. That is, the people who work for an organization are supplying labor to that organization. And the same principles for analyzing buyer power or the organization's power or supply power, which is labor's power with respect to the organization, can be used to analyze the power of labor versus the power of management. So for example, if it is hard for a company to replace me, my power is likely to be higher. If I can find, if there are plenty of jobs available in my area, then my power as a supplier of labor, as an employee that is supplying labor, is higher, and so on. Now let's look at the threat of new entrants. So the threat of new entrants is likely to be lower if there are strong economies of scale. That is, if there are incumbent companies already in that industry structure that are selling at such large volumes at much lower cost, a new entrant who comes in and initially has to sell at a small volume will be at a disadvantage. So therefore, if there are strong economies of scale within an industry, then the threat of new entrants will be lower. The other characteristic is whether there are proprietary capabilities within the companies within an industry structure. So, for example, if you look at the companies within that supply a lot to the military, there are special technologies, there are special capabilities, special knowledge within their people because of the requirements that the military puts on them that they have learned over time. So a new company trying to break into that area is likely to find it difficult because it lacks those proprietary capabilities or knowledge and so on. The third element is brand identity. So if there is a strong brand identity that gives competitive advantage to the companies already within an industry. So for example, take chips. Intel and AMD um, have essentially dominated the processor market, and everybody recognizes their names. So a new chip manufacturer, a new processor manufacturer is unlikely to be able to break in. The fourth thing is switching costs to customers. So customers that are buying from these incumbents or existing players, if they have to pay a lot to switch away from those players to buy the products of a new entrant, then the threat of new entrants is likely to be low. The fifth characteristic is capital requirements, and this is sort of related to economies of scale. If it takes a large amount of money to set up a factory or to acquire new knowledge or to build new relationships or market a product, if the capital required for that is large, then the threat of entrance is likely to be lower. However, if the capital required to set up your business is likely to be low, then the threat of new entrants is likely to be high. Take the IT business, for example. All it takes for a new consulting organization to provide generic consulting services is a computer and a few people. That's why you see a lot of consulting organizations or people who start consulting organizations to provide these kinds of services to customers. The next characteristic is access to distribution. So if you take the grocery business, suppliers of groceries have strong relationships with the grocery stores. They have contracts that allow them to occupy certain areas in the shelves and so on. So a new company trying to sell groceries to a grocery store is likely to have a hard time breaking into that market because all the other players there have established contracts with the grocery store or the marketplace essentially. The next thing is government regulation. So breaking into the airline market, for example, is difficult, not just because of the high capital requirements, but because airlines have to be certified by the government in order to fly their planes for commercial purposes. So breaking into that kind of market is likely to be difficult. The same is true for medicine. Doctors have to be certified before they can practice. Lawyers have to pass the bar exam. These are all elements, if you will, of government regulation that prevent new entrants from breaking into a market. And then finally, it's the expectation of retaliation. So if the market is such that the people already there, the incumbents, are likely to retaliate strongly if a new entrant comes in, then the threat of a new entrant is likely to be low because he's likely to be faced with a big fight if he tries to break into a market.